the common interest before self-interest. Now that sounds to many people plausible, not even good, but if you notice on the screen where I am taking this from, this quote is from the Nazi Party platform. And it's actually in its, what is it, 25 points? It's actually repeated in different iterations at a couple different times. And while there are things that they say in here that, of course, that are not as objectionable as the virulent anti-Semitism and authoritarianism that some would, if you read them, a lot of these propositions, they wouldn't disagree in total. And that's kind of the point. The Nazis, the National Socialist Workers' Party of Germany, used things that they believed would attract people, the party, along with, of course, their whole authoritarian program. But I wanted to point out that that common phrase that's often used of the common good, the public interest, the majority will, the will of the people, the will of the majority, the common interest, that kind of idea, everything that minimizes the importance of the rights of the individual, in the sense that the individual, since they are lesser than the collective in numbers, is lesser than the collective in value. And this is the fundamental principle, I would argue, of all forms of the philosophy of collectivism, which can show up in democracies, it can show up in fascism, it can show up in Nazism, it shows up in racism, it shows up in socialism and communism. This idea, this fundamental assumption or presupposition that, as Spock said, Star Trek, not really a Star Trek guy, more of a Star Wars guy, but as Spock said, the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few or one. And there is a surface validity to that, in that, people have different needs. But if that allows then for people to ignore the rights of the individual in the euphemistic way of saying, well, it's for the common good, or it's in the public interest, then this allows for an authoritarian, coercive government. So the platform argued, different points, says the activities of the individual must not clash with the general interest, but must proceed within the framework of the community and be for the general good. Now, that sounds good, even if the Nazis said it. That sounds good to a lot of people, because what you say, okay, well, individuals shouldn't act selfishly for their own self-interest, which selfishness and self-interest are actually different. Selfishness is acting with a detriment toward other people. Self-interest is just what human beings pursue in order for their own survival and thriving in general. It doesn't have to be the same as selfishness. They can overlap, they don't necessarily overlap. But this idea that the individual must be constrained by that which is against the general interest. Well, who defines the general interest? Who gets to say what the general interest is? Is it every single individual agrees with what the general interest is, or is it the majority? Even if it's the majority, you end up with a situation in which the majority may rule over the minority. And that is the situation in democracy as well, where if we're concerned with the rights of the minorities in a system where they are at a numerical disadvantage because they have less people, then why would we assume that the majority will, the general interest, the general good defined by that majority, is going to protect the rights of the minority, down to not just any type of minority, but down to the very individual, which is the most which is the major definition of a minority. It's a minority of one. So if the majority doesn't necessarily defend it, well, it's the majority of those who vote, the majority of those who vote for a particular thing, or a plurality, those who happen to vote for a particular thing, or if it's not in a democratic system, it's enlightened so-called political elites determine, define, and execute the public good. And when elites, which is actually a very small minority, get to decide the public good, and anyone questioning their dictates is said to be questioning the public good, they may actually work against the good of many individuals and may sacrifice their will, their desires, their good for the expense of the common good, the common self-interest, the good of the people. So what politicians often do and have done throughout history is they define the common good as actions that they want to take in a society. And so the common good is not necessarily the good of everybody or the good of even most people. The common good is usually defined as the will of elites with coercive political power trying to accomplish an agenda. And in doing so, they make that political agenda unquestionable, because to question it is to question the common good. And in so doing, they are able to sacrifice and harm the good of real people in order to accomplish their political ends. So this is the idea of people arguing from the common good, even if they sincerely believe that, is a potentially dangerous proposition that that is shared by all collectivist philosophies, whether they're from the left, the right, or otherwise. Talk about expropriating land for communal purposes, so there's the good of the community there, without compensation. This is, we demand the ruthless prosecution of those whose activities are injurious to the public interest. So therefore, if the people in charge get to define your actions as against the public interest, then they can bring about, as said here, ruthless prosecution against these individuals. So as long as people in power get to define the common good as whatever they happen to believe or want to do, then anyone who stands in their way is expendable. That's what the Nazis did. And that's what other collectivist governments and philosophies do as well. And then they come to this statement of the common interest before self-interest. Common interest before self-interest. Now, this is not just an individual deciding, you know what, I'm going to give up a little bit of what I want to do in order to benefit those around me. You know, kind of that principle of preferring others before yourself, or, you know, something in order to do that. This is the common interest defined by political elites as furthering their goal at the expense of the interest of real people. And so this idea of, well, everything comes down to the common good. Well, the common good, or the will of the people, has often been used euphemistically to really mean the good of the people in charge in order to bring about their goals and disregard the good of anyone who would question them, would stand in their way, would work at cross purposes with them. While the governments involved in this are the ones that have a monopoly on coercive power, and those so-called selfish people working against the common interest, they don't have that coercive power, as bad as they may be. So this is an idea that I think we should think through carefully and challenge of how can we define what the common interest is? Is it possible to define the common interest? Is that the direction that we should be going? Should people in power be able to define the common interest and then use that power of the collective in order to undermine the rights of individuals?